Good morning. This is going to be part one of my video presentation titled March Madness, the Signs They Are A-Changing. So let's see if I can share my screen here and get everything set up. And let's see, I have to hide a couple of things so they don't get in my way. And we are ready to go. March Madness, the Signs They Are A-Changing. And here's just a little comic strip I saw the other day that really seemed to be appropriate. March Madness is just around the corner. I'd say it's here year-round. Boy, well, in 2023, there are going to be a lot of important sign changes going on, and many of them are going to happen in March. March is going to be a very active month, and you might even be feeling a little apprehension as March gets closer, because changing signs, a planet changing signs, it's like changing gears on a car. And there's a moment when you're in between gears, when you're neutral and you don't really have control of what's going on. And that is what can create some apprehension or anxiety. And we're going to have some big sign changes occurring in 2023. And as I said, many of them are going to happen in March. We're going to have Saturn moving into Pisces early on in March. Pluto will move into Aquarius later in March for about 2.5 months. At the end of March, Mars will finally move into Cancer after spending over 7 months in Gemini. And also in March, Jupiter is going to conjoin with Chiron. And later in the year, in May, Jupiter is going to move into Taurus, and in July, the North Node is going to move into Aries. So the signs, they are changing and will be in for quite a ride, particularly in the month of March. Now, additionally, some of the things going on in March, they're going to be a continuation of the 2020 conjunctions of Saturn with Pluto, happened on January 12th, and Saturn with Jupiter, which happened on December 21st of 2020. So let's get started. Going to begin with Saturn semi-sextile Pluto. This is actually going to be the next stage of that 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And Saturn is going to geocentrically semi-sextile Pluto on March 3rd, 2023. So by the time you hear this, it will have already happened. And it's going to heliocentrically semi-sextile Pluto on March 11th, 2023. And to understand why this is important, let's go back to the most recent conjunctions of Saturn, Pluto, and other planets at 22 degrees Capricorn, so that we can put current events into a more historical perspective. Okay, so on January 12th, 2020, Pluto, death, was conjunct Saturn, destruction, in Capricorn, and that began a cycle of transformational structures that will last all the way until 2053. And this was essentially the start of the pandemic and other major changes. And it's also the date on which I got COVID for the first time. Lucky me. Furthermore, since this conjunction occurred in the 22nd degree of Capricorn, this may add extra tension to the situation. And this is because 22.5 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 30-degree cycle, just as 270 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 360-degree cycle. Hence, this position in A sign it's somewhat like the tension of a waning square. Okay. Also, the late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau observed that pandemics and conflicts are often triggered by hard aspects between Saturn and Pluto, particularly when they are magnified either by Jupiter in eclipse or other adverse conditions. And we had all of that going on just 2 days before the exact conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. On January 10th, 2020, Saturn and Pluto, they're already within about 10 minutes of exact conjunction. We have Sun and Mercury at 20 degrees Capricorn, opposite Moon at 20 plus degrees Cancer. We have Jupiter at 8 plus degrees Capricorn, strongly conjunct the South Node and opposition to the Node. And the planet Chiron is adding fuel to the fire by making a wide square to these things. There's a lot of tension at this lunar eclipse, the kind that can set off a pandemic, wars, conflicts, or other things. Now, if we look at things a little bit more deeply, in particular, let's look at how the transits on January 12th were affecting China's chart. You can see you have down here transiting Saturn and Pluto at 20 degrees Capricorn. But looky here, China, in its chart, it has Jupiter at 22 degrees Capricorn, and Jupiter is the ruler of its first house. From an astrological perspective, it's no wonder that the pandemic began in China. We can also look at Putin's chart and how the January 12th, 2020 transits were affecting him. First, I should point out, there is some dispute about the birthday, time, and place of Putin's birth, but this is a chart that most astrologers use, and the date, time, and place have all been confirmed by Putin's webmaster. I've been using this chart for the past few years, and it seems to really work well. So I have faith in it. So let's see what's going on. Well, Saturn and Pluto at 22 degrees Capricorn, they were making a strong quincunx to Putin's natal Pluto at 22 degrees Leo, which is strongly conjunct to South Node in opposition to the North Node, and Pluto rules his first house. And the Saturn Pluto conjunction was also making a strong square to Mercury and Neptune in Putin's 12th house. So what does this do? Well, it's poking at Putin's desire for power. Pluto here, it's in the 10th house. Cusp of this 10th house is pretty much conjunct his south node. And the south node, this sort of represents old things in a way, past karma from other lives, old patterns, habits of being, the path of least resistance. And so Putin, on the one hand, he's clinging to the past. He has all this power, but he wants to restore the past. The North Node points to the future, what he really wants to do, what he has an insatiable desire to do. And the North Node is conjunct the cusp of the 4th house, which is the home, but in Putin's case, this represents the homeland. So this conjunction was poking at Putin's desires to restore the old Soviet Union, bring all these countries that had separated back into the homeland. And it's also stirring up some delusional thinking on Putin's part that will likely be his downfall. So the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is not only connected with the pandemic, it's also connected with what Putin is doing today. Okay, now on March 20th of 2020, we had a conjunction between Jupiter and Mars, but look at this conjunction. It happens at the same degree, 22 degrees Capricorn. So this conjunction both energized and expanded the original Pluto-Saturn impulse. As a result, this is when the COVID pandemic started to grow exponentially. And of course, A couple of years later, it's followed by the war in Ukraine. Okay, now on November 12th, 2020, we had a conjunction between Jupiter and Pluto. And again, it's happening at 22 degrees Capricorn. We're getting the same point, which is a rather tense point within Capricorn, stimulated over and over again. And this conjunction brought the pandemic back to the forefront. However, while Saturn contracts, Jupiter expands. And we saw not only another surge in COVID cases, but on the positive side, we saw the development of effective vaccines. This is when a lot of those vaccines finished that testing phase, and we saw that they were indeed very effective against the original strain of COVID. And then again, February 24th, 2022, we had Mars and Venus both conjunct at 22 degrees Capricorn. And this is when Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is interesting because sometimes with Mars and Venus conjunct, we expect, a lot of love, physical love coming our way. But this is at a rather negative point in Capricorn. Remember, 22.5 degrees is kind of like that tension of the waning square. So this did not work out so well. And on this day, Putin had Russia invade Ukraine. And so the impetus set in motion by that 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction, it was finally beginning to be unleashed in a most destructive way. And later on, we'll look at Ukraine's chart and some other things which show you why it was Russia and why it was Ukraine that are why it is Ukraine that is receiving this aggression from Russia. Let's put it that way. Okay. Now, if we look to see how the transits were affecting Ukraine on February 24th, 2020, well, look at what's happening here. We have Saturn in a pretty good conjunction with Ukraine's moon. That's the people. It's also very strongly squaring Pluto. Pluto's at 17 degrees Scorpio in Ukraine's natal chart, and transiting Saturn was at 18 degrees Aquarius. So this is a pretty strong square, and this, because of the planets involved, this is going to resonate with that Saturn-Pluto conjunction that happened back in 2020. And among other things, look at what we also have here. Chiron at 10 plus degrees Aries, very strong square to Uranus at 10 plus degrees Capricorn in the natal chart. There was a lot of wounding going on. And also we have the lunar nodes making a strong squares to Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus in Ukraine's natal chart. So this was just intensifying the situation. And so what's happening now with Saturn making a semi-sextile to Pluto? Well, this means we're entering that next phase of the synodic cycle between these two planets. The conjunction between Pluto and Saturn, that initiated a period in which a pandemic caused many of the world's structures to break down. This was followed by a dictator's invasion of Ukraine, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But in March, we're entering this new phase in this cycle in which Saturn and Pluto are going to begin to work a little bit more independently of one another. And we're going from this first house relationship between the two planets to a second house relationship. And the second house relationship, Saturn is going to try and stabilize and maintain whatever transformations, good or bad, that Pluto began. Some of the stabilization that's occurring, it's beginning to look like The COVID pandemic is finally being brought under control, and we're going from the pandemic phase to an endemic phase that's characterized by predictable patterns and effective countermeasures. Also, in the war in Ukraine, we seem to be entering a new phase in which now each side is literally entrenched in trench warfare, trying to preserve whatever gains they've made. That's not so positive, but it does reflect this effort of Saturn to just try and stabilize things. But on the more positive side, in the news just the other day, China has released a 12-point peace plan. It remains to be seen whether anything positive will come of that. But at the very least, this may be getting that peace process started. Good things may be beginning. Okay, now let's move on to the next major event in March, which is going to be Saturn entering Pisces on March 7th. And with Saturn in Pisces, on the good side, this is when one's dreams can become reality. And some of the things have happened in the past in years when Saturn went to Pisces. Our Social Security was enacted in 1935. The Beatles and the British invasion music that occurred in 1964. And in 1994, when Saturn moved into Pisces, the World Wide Web came along, which provides an elegant interface for the internet. A lot of people think of the internet as synonymous with the World Wide Web, but if you were involved with the public internet in those few years before 1994, then you will remember that things operated a little bit more differently. About all we could do was we could send email to people, we could download files from servers, and we could upload files to servers, and that was about it. The World Wide Web, that refers to the HTML pages, the web pages that we view today, which are written and coded in hyper text markup language. And it's those pages which provided that very easy to use point and click interface for surfing the internet, surfing the web. So anytime Saturn goes into Pisces, on the positive side, dreams can become reality. So on a personal level, this is a good time to think about what dreams you want to make a concrete reality. It's also a good time to think on a global level, what dreams we want to bring into reality. And this is a very good time and a very important time for everyone to pray, meditate, and visualize world peace to try and bring about a more harmonious world. Now, one thing that's going to be very important here is, well, first, this Saturn transit through Pisces, it lasts a little longer than usual. It's going to last about 3 years. And during that entire time that it's in Pisces, it's going to be co-present with Neptune. And that means that this is going to be somewhat like a 3-year conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. And this is all going to culminate around February 2026 when Saturn and Neptune move into Aries together and are in conjunction at 0+ degrees Aries. And we're going to talk about how both Russia and America will probably be strongly affected by this sojourn of Saturn through Pisces, and it's being co-present with Neptune, and everything culminating in that Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Now, when it comes to Russia, Russia has a history of being affected by Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. There was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1917, right before the Bolshevik Revolution. There's another one in 1952. That year saw the death of Stalin and subsequent de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. And there was a third one in 89, right before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. And I really like this last example because Saturn represents structure, Neptune dissolves structures. The wall was literally a structure that was dissolved under this transit. So for Russia, things could be very unsettling over the next 3 years because of the way in which in the past it's been affected by Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. And for the next 3 years, Saturn and Neptune both co-present in Pisces. That's really like a very long, extended conjunction. Okay, now for America, I generally use both a July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passage of the resolution for independence, and also the July 4th, 1776 chart, uh, which normally has Sagittarius rising, what we call the Sibley chart. But up here, I'm presenting both charts as 0 degrees Aries charts. But anyway, the July 4th, 1776 Sibley chart for basically when George Washington was informed of the decision of this resolution for independence. In each of these charts, we have Neptune and Virgo making a strong square to Mars and Gemini, and thus, whenever we have slow-moving transits through Pisces, it's going to stir up each of these planetary influences. It's going to bring about disinformation, faulty logic, fuzzy logic, represented by Neptune and Virgo, and it's going to stir up a lot of these Martian passions and possible violence in America. We've already seen a lot of this as Neptune has been making its slow transit through Pisces, and now Saturn's going to travel over the same ground, and this can make things very unsettling in America for the next 3 years. Also, if you go back and look at the beginning of the Civil War, it began, I think it was April 12th, 1861. I have to check that exact date. But anyway, it began with shots on Fort Sumter. And the very next day, as the war began, Neptune crossed that boundary from the last degree of Pisces into 0+ degrees of Aries. So we associate Neptune's ingress into Aries with the start of the Civil War. And the first person to ever point that out to me was Houston astrologer Lily Roddy. And since she pointed that out, there have been a lot of historians and pundits on TV and elsewhere talking about how we are repeating the conditions that led up to the Civil War. We have great divisiveness in the country. And so there's been a lot of speculation. Are we headed toward another Civil War? Well, I think we're too intertwined to have that kind of Civil War, but there has been a lot of division in the country. We're separating more into red states and blue states. And we are repeating a lot of the same astrological aspects that occurred right before the Civil War, including the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction Pisces, transiting Neptune opposite natal Neptune, and transiting Neptune square natal Mars. Uranus conjunct North Node in Taurus. This one happened last July 31st, August 1st in 2022. And if you think about what this means, Taurus is ruled by Venus. That represents earthly pleasures, things we like. but also represents the values that people have. And with Uranus conjunct, or with Uranus and Taurus, uh, that adds a sense of rebelliousness and revolution. People are willing to fight based upon their values. Uranus conjunct the North Node, that just intensifies things. Okay, now here's something really interesting. The last time that Uranus was conjunct the North Node in Taurus, it was back, I believe, in 1855 in March. And at that point in time, Kansas was at the epicenter of American politics. It was at the epicenter because Kansas was just about to be officially made a territory of the United States. Not a state yet, but a U.S. territory. And there was going to be a vote on whether the territory of Kansas should be a free territory or slave territory. Well, right before that vote, there were a lot of people who crossed over from the slave state of Missouri into Kansas so that they could legally vote in that election. And as a result of that, Kansas initially entered as a slave territory. A few years later, fortunately, when it became a state, they voted to enter or become a free state. Anyway, these people who crossed that border to legally vote in the election, they went down in history as they were called border ruffians. Well, last year when Uranus and the North Node were conjunct in Taurus on July 31st, August 1st, Kansas was again at the epicenter of American politics, though this time the issue was abortion and a woman's right to make her own decisions and have control over her own body. This conjunction occurred just a few days before Kansas was going to vote on whether to keep a provision in its state constitution that gave women freedom of choice, the right to choose. And from my perspective, they fortunately chose to keep that in the Constitution. But it's still one of the very divisive issues that the country is facing today. And things may come to a head in 2025 or 2026 for both Russia and America. And here's a graphic ephemeris showing what's ahead for these two planets. In the summer of 2025, Neptune and Saturn are going to briefly move for a few months from Pisces into Aries. And it looks like in July, they're getting very, very close to an exact conjunction, but they don't quite make it. They both move retrograde, go back into Pisces, and then in February of 2026, we see them both moving into Aries, and they finally achieve that exact conjunction. So things could come to a head either in this period in 2025 or here in 2026. But, you know, I'd like to think of the years from the years 2020, 2021, 2022. Those years have been like very difficult labor pains, very difficult and very painful. The next 3 years, particularly for Russia and America, it's going to be, as I say, it's sort of like actually giving birth. There's still a lot of difficulty ahead, but the end result could turn out to be very good. Nonetheless, there could be a lot of shakeups in Russia and America over the next 3 years. And I personally think there's a 50-50 chance that Putin will be gone before the end of 2023 and that Russia may collapse. either the current government or the whole country by February 2026. America, I think, is in better shape. There seem to be people, more and more people today, who are trying to find common ground and pull America back toward a center again. But a lot can depend upon who gets elected as president in 2024. We're trying to resolve the threats we've seen to our own democracy, but the next presidential election will probably have a big impact on how things turn out. Okay, the next big event is Jupiter conjunct Chiron on March 11th. And not too many people have talked about this, but I've got a lot to say about it. Jupiter is going to be conjunct Chiron in Aries throughout most of March, and will be exact on March 11th. Of course, Chiron can cause wounding, healing, or transcendence. And Jupiter expands things, while Aries is a sign that seeks independence of self. On the downside, there may be more wounding through war, but on the positive side, there will likely also be some who find a deep spirituality or transcendence within their own being rather than exterior religions. We may or may not immediately see the consequences of this conjunction, but keep an eye out for things related to the keywords above. In just a second, we'll look at things that have happened during past conjunctions of Jupiter and Chiron. But first, let me mention this. Chiron, it resides in between Saturn and Uranus. And it has a very elliptical orbit, which sometimes brings it inside the orbit of Saturn, closer to the sun than Saturn is. And other times its orbit takes it outside of the orbit of Uranus, further away from the sun than the planet Uranus. But it functions primarily as a bridge between Saturn and Uranus. Its primary function, as I see it, is to nudge us toward transcendence, toward going from the personal to the transpersonal, going from those things can be seen like the planets, sun through Saturn. We can visually see those in the sky. Takes us from that to things which are not so readily apparent, not easily seen. Okay? But in this process of transcendence, it often has to crack that hard shell, that structure that Saturn has created. That results in some wounding, which then has to be followed by healing. But its primary function, I think, is to help us seek something more transcendent, something more transpersonal. And so whenever you have a conjunction of Jupiter and Chiron, there may be some wounding going on, but historically there has always been something wonderful and transcendent that's happened too, which has endured. So we had such a conjunction on September 23rd, 1928. It was in Taurus. And the wonderful transcendent thing that happens, it always has something in common with the sign that the conjunction occurs in. Now, Taurus is ruled by Venus. That's things we like. That's our values, things we consider good. But in terms of things we like, it also represents entertainment. And something very transcendent and entertainment occurred in this month. In September 1928, Philo Farnsworth exhibited the world's first working all-electronic television system. Now, it took several years for television to really catch on and become commonplace, but this is where it began. And television is probably the one form of entertainment that is most widespread in the world these days. We use it all the time. And we forget how transcendent it is. It's like telepathy created by technology. We have these sounds and these images that travel through the ether all the way around the world, and we can hear, we can see things happening thousands of miles away. It is just truly incredible and transcendent, and we forget about that because it's become so commonplace. But nonetheless, this is something very entertaining that is transcendent and has endured. Okay, the next conjunction occurred on October 19th, 1945 in Libra. And in addition to having Chiron and Jupiter and Libra, we also had Venus and Neptune. Libra is a sign which has to do about relationships with Venus and Neptune. Also in that sign, we're seeking harmonious relationships, and there may be some idealism involved. So what happened in this month? Well, in October 1945, this was when the United Nations was founded and became operational. And while some may see its aspirations for peace and cooperation as simplistic, and while many have criticized it, it has nonetheless done much good over the years in uniting people and helping to keep lines of communication open in order to resolve international crises. Okay, so the transcendent thing that happened here was the creation of this organization to promote peace, harmony, and dialogue between nations. And then the next conjunction happened in August 21st, 1962 in Pisces. Actually, we had a series of conjunctions between Chiron and Jupiter around 1962. But this is the one I want to focus on, the one that happened in August. And with this conjunction occurring in Pisces, well, that could be transcendent spirituality. We saw that happening in the latter part of the 60s. It got really kicked off later in the 60s when Saturn came into conjunction with Chiron and Pisces, and that made it concrete. But there's some other things we can associate with the sign Pisces. With Pisces, you often see very sophisticated expressions within the various arts, within painting, within dance, and also within music. And so, was there something that came along in music that was very transcendent at the time and very enduring? Yes, there was. The year 1962 was the year that the Beatles began to gel as a group. They found their manager, Brian Epstein, and their producer, George Martin, that year. And in August, as this conjunction was taking place, that is when they found their drummer, Ringo Starr. That's when they literally became the Beatles that we know today. And in September, the next month, they recorded Love Me Do, and the rest is history. They had a new sound that was different from the rock and roll that other artists were doing. And it was something new, which rocked the world and has endured. Okay, next conjunction happened on March 4th, 1976, in the sign of Aries, and we associate Aries with sports, athleticism, with independence, and also with warriors, energetic people. So, what happened during this month that was very transcendent and that endured and that has conformed to the things that the sign of Aries is associated with? Well, in March 17th, 1976, that is when filming began on a little movie that was to be called Star Wars. The new transcendent concept that emerged was that of the Force, that connected everything in the universe. And the Jedi were the spiritual warriors that fought for the light side of the Force. And it was also very individualistic since not everyone could access the Force. And most of the time we saw the Jedi uh, battling either by themselves or most, master and student fighting together. Okay, now, following that conjunction, we had another one on June 16th in 1990 in the sign of Cancer. Of course, we associate the sign of Cancer with family and with home. So what happened at that point in time that was simultaneously transcendent while also having to do with family and home and has endured to this day? Well, in June 1990, that's when a 25-year-old single mother living on state assistance was waiting for a train when she got an idea for a series of novels about a character she called Harry Potter. This series was first published in 1997, and it brought us into awareness of the magic around us. But more importantly, the underlying theme in all the Harry Potter novels is that of family and how Harry was affected by the death of his parents, uh, pretty much rejected by his aunt and uncle and cousin. It was only when he went to Hogwarts that he found a real home and a real family. Notice too, even though the inspiration for this story occurred under this Jupiter Chiron conjunction, it was 7 years before we found out about it. And similarly, even though the filming of Star Wars uh, began under a conjunction of Jupiter and Chiron in Aries, it was not until a couple of years later that the movie was released. And this shows us that sometimes whatever transcendent thing happens under this conjunction, it may be a while, sometimes several years before we even become aware of it, as was the case with the Harry Potter series and also the case with the development of television. Okay, the next conjunction, we had one on May 23rd, 2009 in Aquarius, and this one was very special because look at this, we have a triple conjunction of Jupiter, Chiron, and Neptune, all at 26 plus degrees Aquarius. This combines the humanitarian nature of Aquarius with the compassion of Neptune. And what happened in America at this time? Well, Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House shortly after this conjunction, she introduced Obama's Affordable Care Act. And in December, the Senate passed its version of the bill. In March 2010, it became law and it transformed healthcare in America. Also during this year, many of us realized the higher spiritual nature of Obama's ideals. Furthermore, the conjunction May was conjunct the moon in the Sibley chart for America. As I recall, I believe the moon in the Sibley chart is at 27 plus degrees Aquarius, so that is very close. And that is why this particular triple conjunction had quite an impact on America. Okay, now what did the rest of the world get out of all of this? This Jupiter, Chiron, Neptune conjunction? I would say it was Obama himself and his emphasis on hope and change through dialogue and democratic channels that Chiron gave to the rest of the world. Chiron, or I should say Obama, showed the world how governments could function in such a way through a democratic process, through dialogue, to bring about positive change for everyone. In recognition of this preview of the Age of Aquarius, Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. Well, in March 2023, Jupiter and Chiron will once again be conjunct in Aries. And as in 1976, we expect some sort of individual transcendent spirituality to emerge. Based on past experience, it will change our world, but it may also be a few years, as was the case for Star Wars and Harry Potter, before we realize it. Additionally, America will be deeply affected since this conjunction is also in direct opposition to Saturn to the degree in the July 2nd, July 4th, 1776 chart. So you can see here, Jupiter and Chiron at 14 plus degrees Aries. And in this July 2nd, oh, I've got the July 4th chart here. Okay. And that's good because in this one, you can see, sure enough, the moon was at 27 plus degrees Aquarius, which put it in close conjunction to that 2009 Jupiter-Chiron-Neptune conjunction that we just talked about, which was associated with Obamacare, bringing humanitarian and compassion to the people of our country. Wow. In this chart, you see Saturn, natal Saturn at 14 plus degrees Aries, very strongly in opposition to this conjunction. And this could bring some wounding to America. It's just going to be a few days longer before the opposition between Chiron and Saturn becomes exact. And we're going to talk about that in part 2 of this presentation. Okay. But just focusing on March 11th, as for exactly what will happen, we'll just have to wait and see. And remember that may take several years before we even become aware of whatever event occurs in this month. Nonetheless, we can be fairly certain something transcendent will occur, and it will likely involve individual spirituality or dignity. And this is where I'm going to end part 1. So let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And here I am again. And this takes us almost halfway through the month. So I'm going to stop recording now, and I'll hopefully see you again for part 2 of this presentation of March Madness, the signs they are changing. So long.